President Trump goes to the UN and smacks Rocket Man. So now I have Rocket Man stuck in my head, as does everyone in the United States, because President Trump decided to drop that reference during his UN speech today. We will play it for you. President Trump went to the UN and he gave what I thought was the best speech of his relatively young presidency. I thought it was quite a good speech. We'll go through what was in it and what it shows about American foreign policy, because it does sort of lend credence to the idea that all this talk about realism versus neocons, that a lot of these gaps are a little bit exaggerated, but I'll explain what I mean by all of that. Okay, so President Trump was at the UN this morning, and he gave what was, by virtually all accounts, a very good speech. A lot of people on the left are very upset because he was too mean to Iran and North Korea. He was too militant. How dare he be mean to these countries? Dianne Feinstein sent out the senator from California. She sent out a note saying that it was just terrible. How could President Trump do such a thing? She complained that he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. She said, the goals of the United Nations are to foster peace and promote global cooperation. Today, the president used it as a stage to threaten war. He missed an opportunity to present any positive action the UN could take with respect to North Korea, and he launched a diatribe against Iran, again offering no pathway forward. Okay, a couple of things about this. Number one, the Trump administration was responsible for a unanimous resolution in the UN Security Council levying more sanctions on North Korea. So Trump has done more with the UN on North Korea than Obama ever did. And with regard to Iran, it is the Iran deal that has allowed the Iranians to gain power in the region. It's the Iran deal where President Obama sent literally pallets of cash, like tens of millions of dollars, pallets of cash, to the Iranian regime, which were then funneled towards terrorism, and gave them a pathway, a legal pathway to a nuclear weapon in 10 years or less. Okay, and Dianne Feinstein is ripping Trump over all of this. She says by suggesting he would revisit and possibly cancel the Iran nuclear agreement, he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. No, actually, it's the Iran nuclear agreement that essentially has made it clear to North Korea that they should continue to pursue a nuclear weapon, because once you get close enough to a nuclear weapon, then no one will attack you ever again. Right? What nation would negotiate with the United States when the agreements we reach with other countries are so easily undermined? We reached a negotiation with the North Koreans during the Clinton administration. Dianne Feinstein should know, she was still senator of California at the time, and it didn't make any difference. They developed a nuclear weapon anyway. So the Democrats are fighting mad, and they've been forced into the awkward position of now having to defend some of the worst people on planet Earth. So President Trump at the UN today gave what was a very interventionist speech. I mean, people are portraying this as a realist speech, but this is not really a realist speech, okay? What he was talking about today, he said things like, we don't want to intervene and change other people's systems for them. That's not our goal. But then he talked about Venezuela, and he suggested properly that they need to return to some sort of democratic rule in Venezuela. Well, if you're a hardcore realist, like a Rand Paul realist and a non-interventionist, you'd say, what does Venezuela have to do with us? Okay, so they're oppressing their own people. Okay, so their people are starving en masse. What does that have to do with us? The reality is the vast majority of Americans, as realist as we consider ourselves, still have a moral spine to what we believe about foreign policy. And that doesn't mean we can afford to be the world's policeman or that we should intervene everywhere. It does mean that when we see egregious abuses like in Venezuela, that the U.S. does consider action because the American people generally demand such action. We generally do. Now, a big problem is the American people don't then have patience for such action very often, but the fact that we actually care about Venezuela demonstrates that this is not a hardcore realist America First administration. You can be America First and still pursue America's goals, because one of our goals is the fomenting of democracy and liberalism, like old school classical liberalism, around the world. Again, that doesn't mean military overthrow. Sometimes that means sanctions. Sometimes that means diplomacy. But the idea that Trump is a non-interventionist, I think that didn't survive this speech today. So President Trump starts off by ripping into Venezuela and talking about socialism in Venezuela is pretty spectacular. It's clip 14.
The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented.
Okay. And you hear total silence in the room. And finally, there's a little bit of applause. I like Trump just staring out at them, all the socialist countries who have been imbibing this nonsense for a while. And what he says here is exactly right. This is what I've said for a long time. It's not about socialism being a great idea misapplied. It's about a bad idea being applied properly. Every place that socialism is tried to its full capacity, it leads to massive amounts of human suffering, death, and starvation. So good for Trump on this. Trump also suggested that the world has a moral responsibility to side against aggressors. Here's President Trump talking about Iran and saying that that we have to confront evil or evil will triumph.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea.
Good for him. Okay, well, what he's talking about here is exactly correct. This is a far cry from President Obama, who went in front of the United Nations virtually every year and then whined about how the United States was responsible for all the world's ills. He would go up there and he would talk about how America in the past had been too braggadocious. How we, in the past, we've been too interventionist. It's been our fault. We've made people angry. We've been too arrogant. None of that from President Trump. Good for President Trump. I mean, all this is good. The fact is that we're going to need to see some actual hard policy backing the words. You know, how far is he willing to go? What is he willing to do? That's always the question, right? It's always the Sean Connery question from The Untouchables. What are you willing to do? That's always the big question in foreign policy. And we don't really have a clear answer from President Trump on that. But I know one thing he's not willing to do, and that is apologize for the U.S.'s presence on the world stage. And that's a very good thing. That's and it's reassuring, because the truth is that in the past, President Trump has made sort of Ron Paulian comments about the role of the United States in the world. You remember just a few months ago, he was talking about how the U.S. has killed people like Vladimir Putin. And one of the criticisms that I think is actually not unfair of this speech is that Trump nowhere in the speech mentioned Russia, and Russia's aggression continues. And I think that's perfectly appropriate to point out that President Trump should have mentioned Russia. And that's one critique. The other critique of his speech is this line that he dropped halfway through that is totally Trumpian, where he's talking about North Korea and he just decides to drop an Elton John song in the middle of his speech about North Korea. Here's what he had to say.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission? He's just reading straight from his Twitter feed now. I think it's going to be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again, man. Apparently, the North Korean delegation walked out. Apparently, they were not here for this. They said they let a junior diplomat sit in. They packed their bags last night, pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. So that's, yeah, again, I don't understand what the purpose of the Rocket Man thing is. Like, it's funny, but it also undercuts the seriousness of the situation. I mean, imagine, I saw that there's a great tweet today about this. I do love that there's somebody who tweeted out about, Ronald Reagan suggesting that Ronald Reagan should have gone to Brandenburg Gate and said, well, birthmark head, tear down this wall. Might not have had quite the same impact if he had said that to Mikhail Gorbachev. So I'm not sure what the purpose is of this. It is funny. It is funny. The media are jumping on it, and they are suggesting that this demonstrates that he's not serious, suggesting that he is obviously stupid, and that's why he did all of this. He's Trump, and that's why he did all of this. But, how serious he is about North Korea, well, we're going to find out. We're going to find out, because I don't think North Korea is going to stop this sort of activity. I really don't. It is amazing to watch, however, the media go completely nuts over this speech as though he said something wildly different. Now, here's the thing that's funny. The left is going crazy over this speech because they're suggesting that President Obama never would have been so confrontational. He never would have done anything like this. President Obama launched a virtually useless and counterproductive war in Libya. President Obama signed off on the Iran deal. President Obama did nothing about North Korea. And he used to go there and talk consistently about human rights. President Trump doesn't like talking about human rights very much. But when he goes to the UN, what he is saying is more conducive to human rights than what President Obama said. A niceness on the world stage does not equal the promulgation of human rights. It doesn't equal the spread of human rights. American strength on the world stage equals the spread of human rights around the world. It doesn't mean we're always right. Doesn't mean everything we do is good. Doesn't mean every choice we make is the right one. But it does mean that a stronger America is a freer world, and a weaker America is a less free world. And even President Trump, who sort of began this campaign as an anti-interventionist, the Iraq War was evil and conspiratorial, all of this, he's moved beyond that now, as all presidents do, okay? There's a general foreign policy consensus, no matter how much we wish to buck it. Obama was the first one really to try to buck it. That says that America needs to be strong on the world stage because otherwise the world becomes a worse place. I think Trump understands that, and good for him. Well, we will be back here tomorrow. I want to give you a further breakdown of President Trump's UN speech, plus, as always, the news of the day. I'm Ben Shapiro.
Joining me right now with his thoughts on what we heard from the president, we have Fox News strategic analyst and author of a brand new book, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters. Good to have you here, sir.
Hey,
we've been beating the drum on this, you and me, over and over again. I'm glad to see Mnuchin was there in the audience today. But you know what? I'd like to see a lot more action out of the Treasury Secretary right now. What can and should we be doing?
Well, I think the president's speech, I got to give him credit on this. Certainly, there's going to be a lot of bedwetting in Washington tonight because he spoke plainly and he spoke clearly. And he did not attack the UN virulently. He said sensible things, so I got to give him credit.
Yeah.
And when it comes to North Korea, he's just right. I wish he'd said we'll totally destroy the regime rather than North Korea, but that's nitpicking. Overall, this was a no BS speech, and I think it's just what the UN and the world needed to hear.
A little bit refreshing. I mean, I made the point as we were going to Adam Shapiro's report. In the last 8 years, we heard a very different tone, almost an apologetic tone, right, from President Obama. We're sorry for being the United States of America. Here it was, we're proud of being the United States of America, and guess what? You should all be proud of being your own country as well.
Well, I think the thing is, Obama had much better speechwriters and, frankly, a more artful delivery. He had soaring rhetoric. Trump deals in prose. But at the end of the day, Obama's rhetoric was empty and destructive, and as he said he was always weeping about how bad the United States was. And whereas Trump, I've not been his biggest fan, but at the UN he sent the message that, hey, UN, you do some stuff right, but let's fix the other stuff.
Yeah,
hey,
you know what?
Korea.
I get it, and we'll get to North Korea in a second. But I do think you're onto something. And I think he did this on the campaign trail as well. And he's threading together two themes here. One is we can do better, and we will do better. In other words, there's still an optimistic tone, if you would, Colonel Peters, to what we're hearing.
Yeah, it's really a tough thing because he breaks so much China. He breaks the diplomatic rules. But again, I think it was just the right thing to do, to tell the UN up front, no diplomatic language here. This is what we want. This is what we're going to do. This is what we'll do for you. This is what you need to do for us. Very transactional. And at the end of the day, he covered a lot of ground. But I'll tell you where he won me over. It was early in the address when he suddenly, speaking about intolerable aggression, he cited Ukraine and the South China Sea, obviously Russia and China. And boy, that was great. That's actually the firmest stand I've heard him take about Russia. And I think what it's telling us is, contrary to the worst fears on the left and others, and some of my own fears, he is growing in the job. He is listening to the right people. He's getting rid of the dead wood in his administration, bringing along really sound performers like Mnuchin, like obviously Jim Mattis. He's got Kelly running a tight ship now. And so I'm more hopeful for this presidency than I've ever been.
You know, Colonel Peters, that's exciting to hear from you. You've been quite a critic all along. So you're starting to... Hey, look, I mean, what I liked about today's speech, I'll tell you, Colonel Peters, is that it was normal speak, shall we say. In other words, you say, yeah, he's breaking some China, no pun intended, but that's okay. That's okay, because sometimes I think you got to back away from all the words, right? You bogged down in these words and you lose what the message is. He makes it very clear what his message is, and that is our message. It should be our message.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, I have a weakness for stirring, lofty rhetoric. I love Lincoln's speeches. But there are times when you just have to say, buddy, I'm going to knock your teeth out. And that's what Trump does. And so, even for me, it's a hard adjustment, having been a soldier for 22 years. But I don't agree with any president and everything. But I think Trump deserves good marks for staying on message and sending the right message today.
All right. Well, okay. High marks from Colonel Peters. I think a lot of people are in agreement here. It was a very powerful speech.